Academia is supposed to be searching for truth.
Yes.
And there are various ways to search for truth. Science is the way to search for truth about the natural world. But if you're looking for truth about the spiritual world, science is the wrong set of tools. It's not going to get you there. You need there to understand the tools of the Spirit.
But is what gets you there faith? Is that it?
Ultimately, it leads you to faith. But let me say, I think this notion that faith is somehow the antithesis of reason is completely wrong.
Explain why.
So faith is, in fact, the most rational of all choices when you sort of look at the spectrum between atheism and belief. Let me tell you what. Imagine this table represents all of the knowledge that ever has existed or will exist in the universe. A lot of stuff.
Right.
And then ask any individual, where in that table is your own personal knowledge right now? And even the most confident of us will draw a tiny little circle. Now, suppose the knowledge of the existence of God is outside your tiny little circle. How then could anybody who's not a wacko say, I know there is no God? Is that not the most irrational position? Does that not require the greatest faith of all? I would argue that already in our little circle, there's evidence of the existence of some supernatural being. The Big Bang, for instance. Did the universe create itself? I don't see how that could happen.
God created the Big Bang?
Well, something outside of nature presumably had to preside over the creation of something out of nothing. And when you look at the way the universe is tuned, where all of these constants are precisely having the value that's necessary for matter to coalesce and for life to be possible, it's almost impossible that such a thing would have happened. The probabilities are infinitesimal. That sort of makes you wonder. Even Stephen Hawking, who did not come at this exactly as a believer, writes in his book, The Brief History of Time, this has religious significance. And it does. So you can look at the logical evidence and bring yourself right up to the cliff's edge of saying it makes sense that there is a God. But then you still have to decide whether to take
Because you can't explain it in science?
You can't explain some of these things in science, and you can't answer some of the questions.
Scientists can't explain the Big Bang?
No. They can explain that it happened, but they can't say what happened before. It's a discontinuity.
What happens after we die?
Well, I believe, as somebody who has gone down this long journey of trying to understand faith, that there is something outside of what we see here, and that after we die, we'll find out a lot more about what that's like. I don't know exactly what its characteristics are going to be.
In fact, you have no idea.
I have a glimmer.
Why do you have a glimmer?
Because I have...
I mean, a believer would make you say, because of a series of things, experiences of my own, you would say, I came to believe that, but I don't know. Nobody's spoken to me. Sure, nobody's spoken to me either. That's my point, yeah.
But I do think faith is not one of those emotional reactions that you carry with you the rest of your life. At least it's not for me. It is going through the evidence, as Lewis did, as I have done, as many others wiser than I have done, and coming to the conclusion, look at St. Augustine, who is a wonderful model of this, that it is much more plausible to accept God's existence than the alternative. And then, once you reach that point
plausible to accept God's existence?
Yes. Plausible. Right.
So when you put the unexplained versus the explained, the only way you can figure out the unexplained is to say it must be God. This certain things.
I think the evidence is more consistent with that than the alternative. Again, I think agnosticism is an entirely intellectually justifiable position, which is the alternative of simply saying, I can't know. I think atheism is not a logical position. But agnosticism is a little thin. Oftentimes it is not the agnosticism of, I've considered all the evidence and I don't think it's possible to know. Oftentimes it's just like, I don't really want to deal with this. So it's more comfortable to take a position of it's unknowable, when in fact that's confusing the unknowable with what might be known if one did some more searching. And what I did when writing this book was try to describe my own pathway towards that searching as a scientist, and to argue something that I think has been lost a lot lately, that is that the scientific worldview and the spiritual worldview are entirely compatible. They coexist within me on any given Thursday afternoon. They make my practice of science more meaningful because it's also an investigation of God's creation. They make my faith more meaningful as well. And the idea that this harmonious middle ground between the extremes of shrill atheism on the one hand and fundamentalist Bible thumping saying that science can't be trusted on the other, that middle ground needs to be supported, encouraged, and young people need to know especially that it exists, because it may be hard to tell these days.
Richard Dawkins on this show also said, take a look at this.
I'm an atheist, but most evolutionists in America would probably pay lip service to the idea that there is no contradiction between them, and that people who want to believe in God do so long as they don't trespass on science's turf.
What's the best thing you can say about faith?
Not a lot. I mean, I think faith is pernicious because it teaches people, especially teaches children, that believing something without evidence is a virtue. And in extreme cases, it teaches people
or is it just believing about one thing as a virtue?
Either way, I think it's a bit pernicious, because I think that children should be taught to seek evidence. They should be taught to be skeptical. If they're told something, they should immediately say, what's the evidence for that? Whereas faith teaches you not to ask for the evidence. It teaches you this is true because it's true because it's true. You just have faith and you don't have to justify it.
Richard Dawkins, a popular scientist from Cambridge, and
very articulate
very articulate guy. You would part company with what he said?
I would agree with what he said, that we should teach young people to seek the evidence before drawing a conclusion. That's what drew me to become a believer after I had been an atheist. When I went and looked at the evidence, it was more convincing to me to believe in God than not to. The mistake that I think Dawkins makes is he only accepts scientific evidence as any criterion for making a decision. If God exists, God is outside of nature. Science is the way we investigate nature. It does not help us with this question of God.
Let me put this finally into the picture. You and Craig Venter got lots of credit for mapping the human genome. Did that have an impact on any of this? Because, as you and I had many discussions at that time on this show, one of the results of that was to help us ask the question, what makes us human?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had been a believer for a couple decades before that came along. For me, doing science was an opportunity to glimpse a little bit of the mind of God. And that certainly was true of reading out the letters of the human DNA. It is, in my view, this wonderful language that God spoke into being, bios, life, through logos.
He spoke into being, meaning?
So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, the opening words of the first chapter of John. God as the Word, speaking life, speaking peace, speaking love into the world is a very fundamental part of Christian belief. But the Word, interestingly, is also a language. DNA is a language. We're getting a little metaphysical here, but it seems to me if you're willing to accept that evolution had a purpose, that the why was actually God's intention of creating us, then this language you can think of in a certain metaphorical way as God speaking into being, this wonderful double helix with its 4 letters, spelling out information for every living thing in this wonderful, diverse planet we live on.
Finally, for me, where are we in mapping the human genome, your science hat? Because that was just the beginning.
Yes.
What we would learn from it, what we would do with it. Tell me what's happened since, was it 2000?
2000, we had the draft.
Right.
The finished sequence was completed in April 2003.
Okay, 3 years later.
So now, 3 years after that, we are well along with applying that to medical benefit, which was always the point. I'm a physician. The reason I got excited about this project was its hope to transform the practice of medicine. We are starting to see that in isolated instances of particular diseases, particularly cancer. But the full flowering of that genomic revolution is now clearly coming, but probably in the neighborhood of 10, 12 years away. We will, in the next 2 or 3 years, discover the major hereditary factors in diabetes, heart disease, cancer, asthma, schizophrenia, and a very long list of diseases that have been so elusive for so long. We now have the tools to do that because of the Genome Project. And that is going to open our eyes to the causes of illness and provide us with the tools to practice prevention and treatment in ways that we could not have previously dreamed of. It's a very exciting transformation, turning us into truly a rational kind of science that we can apply to medicine and do great things, and things that we desperately need to do for all those people whose diseases we currently don't understand.
So the hope is even more realizable.
Yeah, absolutely.
3 years after.
We get closer every day.
And where are you on the stem cell debate?
So as a faithful government employee, director of an NIH institute, this is one of those issues that I'm not entirely at liberty to talk about, but I do talk about it a bit in the appendix to this book. I do think human embryos that are created by fusion of sperm and egg are important moral entities and are somewhat different than what happens in this somatic cell nuclear transfer process, which maybe is a more promising medical approach anyway. But I think our main problem with stem cells is we've muddied up the whole thing. We collectively, by the rhetoric that has been applied, and I have to say, particularly in the political system, so that I don't think most of the issues are very clear right now. The difference between an embryo formed by a union of sperm and egg or by transferring a skin cell into an oocyte, profoundly different, but equated in many people's minds, calling both an embryo, giving them both the same moral status. We need to at least step back from those dug-in positions if we're going to make any headway.
It's always great to see you.
It's always wonderful to see you too, Charlie.
This book is called The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. Francis S. Collins.